morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Isotta, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this annual conference hosted by the European Network for the Work with Perpetrators of Domestic Violence on the topic of critical cases, understanding and responding to high-risk domestic violence perpetrators. Without further ado, allow me to share a couple of slides with you so that we can go over some key information and housekeeping that hopefully will make your experience and this conference one of the best so far. Bear with me for just a moment. Right, so just a reminder about the European Network for the Work with Perpetrators of Domestic Violence. Many of you are already familiar with the network. It brings together around 70 members from 35 countries. It's both organizations working with perpetrators and working with victims, as well as organizations doing research on domestic violence. It was founded to address violence in close relationships with a key focus on gender-based violence with a lens of gender equality. And a key objective is obviously to improve the safety of those at risk from violence. Today, we're having a bit of a mix between keynote speeches, presentations, plenary workshops, as well as more interactive workshops later on in the day and the virtual social networking. Please don't forget to join us later today for that. When it comes to day 2, that will be more or less the same in terms of mix of different presentations, plenary workshops, and so on. If Stephen, please, you could change the slide to day 2. Here we go. We'll have a keynote speech. The peculiarity tomorrow will be the MARAC, the mock MARAC, the Multi-Agency Risk Assessment Conference. And again, we'll have interactive workshops, a joint feedback session, and the closing. Some technical information for you, since you would have already noticed we've had a bit of a rough start when it comes to tech. There's a chat box. You would have been prompted to enter your name in the chat box as soon as you joined the platform. The chat box is really important. You can use it to tell us how you're doing, to comment, and crucially, to ask questions. Below the chat box, there's a button to participate in live polls, and we'll be testing that in just a moment. There's also a button for feedback. That's for us to get your input on this conference and your views and thoughts on how it's been for you. Please make sure to give us that feedback. If you're leaving at any point today and you're not planning on coming back tomorrow, make sure you press that button before you go. You also have workshop buttons. You can see them below the screen. These will lead you to the workshops and our plenary workshop later. These will take place on Zoom. So we'll be using this platform as well as Zoom for the workshops and the plenary workshop. As I said, you should have also received the link via email. So in case you're lost, please check your email or come back to this platform and click on those buttons. If you have any tech issues, you can refresh your browser. You can try connecting from another device. You can also drop an email to hello@fundraisingeverywhere.com. Please keep an eye out for emails in case there's emergency last-minute changes. And I mean, the good old, have you tried turning it off and on again, seems to work. So keep that in mind as well. You will be receiving a recording of this conference after the conference itself. It will be sent out to all attendees. So in case you miss something, don't worry about it too much. We'll make sure that you are filled in at a later stage too. Now, just because this is a pretty intense conference, we're talking about critical cases, we're talking about high risk. Just a reminder that some of the content or elements of the content that we will be discussing today and tomorrow might trigger you in some shape or form in ways that perhaps you didn't expect either. Just keep in mind that you should be looking after your well-being and possibly keep an eye out for the well-being of others in workshops, and do whatever it is that you need to take care of yourself and be at your best and enjoy the conference to the most. It's time to hear from Dean Ajdukovic. He is the chair of the WWP board. He will share with us his opening remarks. So on to you, Dean.
Dear participants, welcome to this yearly conference of the European Network for Work with Perpetrators. As you may know, our network includes 69 organizations throughout Europe and is constantly growing. This year's topic is particularly important as it deals with high risk and harm of perpetrating violence against women in the context of domestic violence. When we asked our members a few years ago about topics of interest and priorities that we should address, one of the topics that came up was work with high-risk perpetrators. We've put this request into practice and today welcome you to the conference filled with interesting input on these complex topics. Perpetrators that pose a high risk are not a homogeneous group. They often struggle with multiple issues such as drug addiction, including alcohol, mental health issues, severe trauma, and so on, but also a low motivation to change, which makes it particularly challenging to work with these men. While it is essential to ensure well-coordinated multi-agency work and close monitoring, it is also important to have a comprehensive and common understanding of risk and how to mitigate it. I'm therefore looking forward to our conference program today, which will start with a keynote to better understand what we mean when we talk about high-risk perpetrators, and extend our understanding of harm caused to victims of domestic violence. We will also learn more about trauma-informed work with perpetrators, experience a simulated multi-agency risk assessment conference, also known as MARAC, and learn about European femicide research and what it can tell us about identifying high-risk cases. Over this rich conference program includes 2 keynote lectures, 3 plenary presentations and sessions, and 8 workshops. Please also note the opportunity for virtual social networking towards the end of today's program, and I suggest to use it. We at Work with Perpetrators are busy completing the work on the standards and developing the accreditation system for the perpetrator programs, outlining the training requirements for staff delivering such programs, re-granting network members to facilitate their development and work in their respective communities, and we are doing different mappings, such as the one commissioned by the Council of Europe. And we are, of course, doing many other demanding tasks. I want to announce that WWP will offer a training on working with high-risk perpetrators in November this year. Of course, members will be notified in time and asked to register. We are also proactive in relation to the European Commission's proposed directive on combating violence against women and domestic violence. There was a public consultation process on the proposed directive where the Commission invited proposals for amendments. We had a meeting with our national networks among WWP members to collect their input on our suggested amendments, and then we sent them to the European Commission. But now I would like to thank institutions and the individuals who helped bring about today's conference. So thanks to the funders, European Commission and Oak Foundation, to the annual conference preparation committee, including board member Iris Loarassi and board member Christian Skambor, Kate Ivey from the Tower Hamlets Positive Change Service, Ola Kurowicka and Antonia Montanos from WWP team. And of course, people working in the background, like all the WWP team members who have supported the preparation of this annual conference in different ways. And Nikki Bell and her team from Everywhere Plus, who have helped us bring the conference online and are providing all the technical support. And last but not least, all the attendees for joining us. Special thanks go to member of the European Parliament, Francis Fitzgerald, and Anna Esquerrà Roqueta from the Confederation of European Probation, who will both provide institutional greetings. Francis Fitzgerald is the European Parliament lead negotiator for the proposed new EU directive on combating violence against women and domestic violence, and we are very honored that she provides the first institutional greetings today. With the Confederation of European Probation represented by Anna Esquerrà Roqueta, we have been collaborating for years now and we highly value the exchange with them and our plans for further collaboration. Please enjoy the conference. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dean, for your thorough introduction. Next up, as Dean anticipated, are the institutional greetings by Francis Fitzgerald, member of the European Parliament and lead rapporteur on the EU Directive on Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, as well as Anna Roqueta Esquerrà, the Policy and Liaison Officer for the Confederation of European Probation.
Morning, and I'm delighted to be joining you virtually. Apologies that I cannot be with you in person due to commitments in the Parliament today. Firstly, I want to thank Alessandra and all the team at Work with Perpetrators for your kind invitation here today, but most importantly for your important input into my work as rapporteur on the Directive on Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, and for all the work that you do. The work on the directive is now advancing quickly after the European Parliament and the Member States adopted their positions before the summer. Parliament's position, that's the one I worked on, includes many of the suggestions made by Work with Perpetrators, and we will be working to incorporate these into the final position. Let me mention some of these. WWP recommended that all perpetrators who've been convicted of an offence should mandatorily be obliged to participate in an intervention programme. The European Commission, however, only proposed this for second-time offenders. I'm happy to say that the European Parliament agreed with WWP and have proposed this to be mandatory for all who've been convicted of an offence. Unfortunately, the Member States have stricken out any requirement, so this will have to be discussed as part of our ongoing negotiations, the trialogues in other words, so people take different positions. Likewise, when it comes to training for professionals working with offenders, Parliament sought to include training for these professionals where the Commission omitted them. Again, the Member States did not include these professionals, so it will form part of our discussions. You can see the difficulties. When it comes to the safety of children, here once again, Parliament and Member States took diverging views. Parliament sought to include intervention programmes for holders of parental responsibility. The Member States did not include that. Finally, when it comes to prevention, Parliament was very clear that this was the most important section, in fact, and one that needed considerable strengthening. So Parliament now has a very strong position when it comes to prevention, incorporating comprehensive sexuality and relationship education, increasing sensitivity to the concept of consent, and emphasising the need for critical thinking. Finally, it absolutely seeks to include intervention programmes as an aspect of prevention for those outside of the criminal justice system. The Member States have sought to add small references, highlighting that they too see it as crucial. So hopefully we'll end up with a stronger wording in the final text. So I hope that that gives you some helpful information as to the areas that concern us. It's an ongoing process, as you can see, and particularly in relation to work with perpetrators specifically. I believe that violence against women, whether online, in the home or elsewhere, has become the new staging post for our endless, exhausting battle for equal rights. And it's imperative upon all of us to do more. For those of you interested in following this directive in greater detail, do pay attention to the Council side about the legal basis in the EU treaty. Now, this is often a smokescreen for more substantive concerns. Contrary to what the European Commission has said in its assessment, there are concerns among Member States, quite a lot of them in fact, that there is no sound basis for the EU to legislate on rape as one form of gender-based violence, even though the EU treaty lists sexual exploitation as one of those crimes for which the EU can establish common definitions and minimum sanctions, a so-called Eurocrime. I appreciate there are concerns and sensitivities. I also know that when you're trying to determine what is a legal base isn't always straightforward. It's not always black and white. Sometimes it's political, with political preference that may tilt the balance between legal basis or no legal basis. Despite this, I am shocked at the current approach of the Member States not to include rape in a directive on violence Women in Europe in the 21st century do not accept this. So I would ask all of you to work with your government to make sure that rape is included in this directive at the end. We really do not want to accept anything less, because so many women are killed every day throughout Europe, throughout the world. Every couple of minutes, 11 minutes, a woman or a girl is killed in their own home. 6 killed every hour by men around the world, mostly by those they intimately know. It's hard to believe these statistics. It really is extraordinary. So we need your help and assistance, in particular, to raise the issue of the inclusion of rape in the final text of the directive. Only together can we make Europe the first continent to eradicate violence against women. So I hope you have a very successful Congress, and thank you once again for inviting me to say a few words to you on these important topics today. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. It is a real pleasure to welcome you to the annual conference of the European Network for Work with Perpetrators, focusing on high-risk domestic violence perpetrators. Let me start by thanking Alexandra and all her team for inviting us to the conference. The European Network for Work with Perpetrators has become an important partner for CEP over the past years, and the conference topic is in many ways connected to the work of CEP and to many of our members who implement treatment programs for domestic violence and sex offender perpetrators. My name is Esquerrà, and I'm representing CEP. Just very briefly, CEP is the Confederation of European Probation. It was created more than 40 years ago in 1981 by 10 European countries who decided to exchange information on foreign nationals. Nowadays, CEP has 90 members representing 39 EU countries and 42 EU jurisdictions. Our aim is to promote the social inclusion of offenders through community sanctions and measures such as probation, community service, mediation, and conciliation. CEP is committed to enhance the profile of probation and to improve professionalism in this field on a national and European level by organizing different kinds of activities, conferences, workshops, expert groups, networks, commission researches, and others. For further detailed information on our activities, you can check our website, www.cep-probation.org. Please be our guests. In the past years, we have seen an increase on domestic violence cases. Domestic violence is a serious human rights violation affecting not only personal safety and security of victims, but also preventing their full participation in society. Their causes include discrimination and gender inequality. It can be experienced by all genders. However, the vast majority of victims are women and girls, and it causes several harm to families and communities. Probation bodies across Europe and worldwide, together with other criminal justice professionals, are among those on the front line of preventing violence by supervising and providing specialized treatment programs, guidance, and assistance to offenders, victims, and families. CEP is very much committed to supporting all the stages of offender rehabilitation, as well as the work with victims, providing high-quality international activities on this topic. From CEP, we have different expert groups, and one of these expert groups is on domestic violence in probation. Following the indications of the European Commission and also a CEP internal audit on this topic, this group will be very soon merged with the sex offenders expert group and will be focusing on working on gender-based violence in probation. Besides these expert groups, CEP will also organize, actually every year organizes one workshop on gender-based violence in probation, which will include, and actually includes, the perspective not only from domestic violence, but also sex offenders. Just for your information, CEP will organize this workshop this year in November in Barcelona. I also would like to mention that when developing social policies to prevent gender-based violence offenses, it is crucial that there is a real cooperation at different levels. At European level, I would like to mention the work that is currently being done on the directive combating violence against women and domestic violence, which will represent a huge step further to prevent and combat those cases. I also would like to highlight the work and efforts of many different European countries and probation services that try to improve their work with domestic violence cases, sharing good practices and implementing perpetrators program. Although there are many efforts coming from different sides, there is still a lot to be done. It is important to identify those who are sentenced for other crimes, but possibly also have indicators of domestic violence. Attention needs to be paid to the differences in cultural and religious backgrounds and to increase the knowledge about this matter in order to tackle domestic violence in different contexts. It is also crucial to pay attention to child protection and work with victims. I also would like to bring attention when reflecting the role of community when released, at the end of the sentences, as well as during probation. And very important as well, to continue evaluating intervention programs for perpetrators. Last but not least, I would like to wish you a super fruitful conference and that you can explore and discuss on good practices in relation to risk assessment, multi-agency cooperation, trauma-informed practices, and many other useful aspects when working with high-risk domestic violence perpetrators. Thank you very much to you all again. Thank you very much for inviting us, and see you today later on during the workshops. Thank you. Bye.
A heartfelt thanks to Frances Fitzgerald and Ana Esquerrà Roqueta for setting the scene, both in terms of European developments in the field of gender-based violence and perpetrator work, as well as regards the input and role of WWP in these broader developments. I'd say we're ready, more than ready, for our keynote. So I'm excited to introduce to you our very first keynote speaker, Chris Newman. Chris Newman is Director of PAI Family Safety Assessments, a London-based organization that provides specialist assessments for the family court in cases where domestic abuse is a child protection concern. He has 25 years experience delivering individual work and group work with men addressing their violence and abuse to partners in the community as well as in criminal justice settings. He has been involved in developing and delivering risk assessment and risk management intervention in family cases for over 20 years and is an acknowledged expert in this area. He provides consultation and supervision to a range of organizations working with violence in the family and has long experience of training professionals in the field. He was also involved recently in writing a practical guidance for social workers dealing with cases where domestic violence is a child protection concern. His keynote speech is titled Unpacking What We Mean When We Say High Risk. Do we need new tools or a framework for thinking? Chris, the floor is yours. If it's okay with you, I'll chip in when you have 5 minutes to go. Thank you.
So thank you very much to WWPN for inviting me to speak today. It's a great honor, and it's been a real privilege working with the people in the network. I've always been very impressed with their professionalism and their dedication to this difficult topic and bringing together expertise across different nations. So we're thinking about this issue of risk and high risk and critical cases and so forth. And I guess the first place I'll start, what in this talk we'll kind of briefly drop back to the basics of what risk assessment and what we're doing when we assess risk, and then have a think about this, also about risk assessment at kind of at the agency level, and then how that pans out. This is a conference for people who work within perpetrator programs one way or another, and so how that pans out within our practice within domestic abuse perpetrator programs as well. So why are we doing it? I think the distressing prevalence of domestic abuse in our societies, I'm homing in on the UK here, 1 million calls a year for domestic abuse related offences, a call out every 30 seconds, you know, so that's a phenomenal input of cases to any agency or any set of people who are hoping to deal with this problem. And so there has to be some kind of triage, some kind of sorting, some kind of organizing different cases into levels. Otherwise, all agencies would be utterly overwhelmed. And so, you know, risk assessment tools and risk assessment methods and ways of thinking about risk are designed to target those often scarce resources to where it's most needed, you know. And the methods and the thresholds of those risk assessment frameworks may differ according to the aim. So it might be different if you're trying to, if your primary aim has been to reduce the number of very, very severe events like family murders and femicide and so forth. There's been recently another focus, which is really just noticing that a relatively small group of men are causing a disproportionate amount of harm. You know, when you unpack offending statistics, what you find is that there's a relatively small group of men who are moving from from relationship to relationship and multiply offending within those relationships and basically causing havoc amongst families, you know. But then, of course, it's like every victim of domestic violence deserves help and attention. And so we also need to identify the full range of risks, to any victim that comes to us, you know. And in my field, that also pans out very much to the question of what is the cumulative harm to a child of growing up in an environment where a perpetrator of domestic abuse is disrupting the family, is harming the main carer. So these all have different, I guess, emphases, ways of different things that need to be emphasized when we're thinking about risk assessment. And within a perpetrator program, what are we doing? I guess we are working with a group of men who we know to be dangerous in one form or another at different levels. So that means that we also know a group of women, or we have, you know, contact with a group of women who we know are at risk, you know, and so sorry, I saw a chat thing there. So we know that we need to be managing risk on an ongoing basis, you know, and if somebody in our group is showing signs of risk, of danger, of agitation, whatever it may be, we may need to take imminent action to reduce that risk. But then, of course, also, we're also assessing risk to, you know, just to help facilitators understand what they're working with. You know, these men walk into our rooms and they have their account of what they've done, which often needs reality checking against what has actually happened, whether that be the case records and or the victim's account, you know. And it's very, very important that facilitators have the opportunity to have the perpetrator's account reality checked, so just so that they know what they're working with, and so they can really understand what this particular person's pattern of abuse is and what are the drivers for that. You know, you can dig around for what the drivers for that as targets for intervention. And then lastly, very importantly, we're trying to assess whether or not this person's participation on the program is likely to bring about change, you know. And you know, the victim needs to know that, you know, the agencies around us need to know that. And particularly once somebody's away into the program and maybe wanting to, you know, convinces the victim that he's changed, or wants to convince the court that he's changed or whatever, we have a responsibility to communicate with people around us and the agencies around us about whether or not that is realistic, I guess. So as I was putting this talk together, I was discussing this issue with one of my colleagues as well. And for me, it's a real question. I don't have an answer to this question, but I think it's a real question that maybe people could be thinking about, you know, while I'm talking, and maybe in the plenary afterwards, which is whether or not perpetrators who've been labelled for one reason or another as high risk, I suppose that they're committing high severity offences is probably the most likely definition? Do they need a different kind of treatment? Rather than a different kind of risk management, do they need a different kind of treatment, different program than those who are committing less serious harm? And if so, why, and what would be different? I think it's a really valid question, and it's coming up quite a lot in practice, certainly in the UK. Have a think about that. Yeah. So just to drill down into what we're doing when we assess risk, what are we doing? The most crucial thing we're doing is gathering information. And this is when risk assessment feels vague and difficult to do. It's nearly always because the information that we need isn't there, you know? And then we're having to bring that information together to form a judgment about risk. It could be a risk score if we're using that kind of assessment, or it could be more qualitative description. And so we're coming to some statement about the level of risk that this person poses and the type of risk this person poses. And then, of course, the purpose of that is then to move into different forms of risk management, you know? So when it comes to information gathering, I think we kind of know what the information we need to gather. Do you know what I mean? That there's a, you know, all the risk assessment tools and frameworks will be drawing upon this kind of information. There may be some extra things, or, you know, there may be some less things depending upon the filtering process the risk assessment method uses. But nevertheless, we kind of know what we need to ask about. And I think if there's any crucial message that I continually put forward in my supervision and when I'm working with social workers and when I'm giving evidence in court and that kind of thing, is that it's that this is the most crucial information that we need. Yeah. And that's the one that we need to find out about from the people who refer to us if we're working in a perpetrator program, and that the referrers have a responsibility to give to us if we're working in a referral program. And it's the one that we need to understand from the victim's point of view and also from the perpetrator's point of view. And any thorough assessment will be addressing many of these other factors as well. And so then how do we bring it together to form a judgment about risk? Well, one way is I suppose, one way is to just kind of unaided clinical assessment. It's our kind of ballpark assessment when we first start hearing about a case, that kind of thing, you know. And there's interesting research actually which shows that without collateral information, even the most experienced practitioners kind of score at chance when it comes to prediction of risk just from information from the client, which is, I suppose, unsurprising, really, particularly when you look at the way domestic abuse perpetrators present themselves, where they tend to really play down the risk that they present, you know. Another way of doing it is to really try and nail it down. And this is what the actuarial assessment people do. And what they do, they effectively treat it like car insurance companies treat just calculating your premium. You know, they just get a massive data set, look at the different factors that are associated with harm and do a statistical crunching exercise and come out with an assessment that you can score. You know, and it comes out with actually, comes out with very, how should we say, precise kind of percentage estimates, which I'll show you right now what they look like. You know, so this is an example simply because I use this one because it's the one that's kind of most, I guess, most precise looking in its estimates. You know, the Ontario Domestic Assault Risk Assessment, very, very well researched, massive data set, very, very well regarded research group. You know, so it's the kind of the gold standard of actuarial risk assessment. And if you are triaging, if you have a large group, big group of cases that you need to sort in some way or another, whether to give immediate attention to them, you know, in terms of support or police intervention, or whatever it may be, then this kind of assessment kind of does the job for you, because it's kind of saying, what it's saying is it's giving you a percentage rating that people in that group will offend again, you know. However, if you've got a man in front of you, you know, and you're talking with his wife, I suppose, or his partner, or with somebody who's worried about the risk he's posing, and let's say he scores 7 to 13, what you can say about this is 74% of men like this, not this guy, but 74% of men like this who have this score will commit another assault against an intimate partner that comes to the attention of police within an average of about 5 years. So it starts to come apart a bit in terms of its usefulness when you're thinking about individuals, because of course, another assault, is that a slap or is it a strangulation, you know? that comes to the attention of police. Sorry, I've got to keep my eyes away from the chat. That comes to the attention of police. Well, we know that many assaults don't come to the attention of police within an average of about 5 years next week, or in 4.5 years' time. You can see what I mean. So when we're thinking about actual cases and the people in front of us, we need to be unpacking in a much more, I guess, person-specific way, I think, you know. And so this leaves us with probably the most appropriate and probably most common way of assessing risk within domestic abuse settings, I think, which is the idea of structured professional judgment, which is what you're doing is when you're making your inquiries, they are being directed by the research, you know. You're not just asking about anything that you think might be useful. You're asking about what factors are demonstrated in research to have a link to reoffending. And so you're focusing on the relevant data, and you're bringing that together in a judgment of risk. And I think importantly, the key thing here is that there are frameworks to do this. So there's the SARA, the Spousal Assault Risk Assessment Framework. There's the Be Safer, its briefer version. There are other frameworks. The framework I use in my work around family court assessments is a structured professional judgment method. And so you can have frameworks that will guide you through this. But I think the really crucial thing, if we haven't got a framework in front of us, is that the framework for thinking is the same. You know what I mean? What we know is that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, unfortunately. It's a truth about humanity, unfortunately. And so when we're forming an assessment of risk, what we need to do is to give the most weight to the person's history, and particularly what they've done, and in most particularly of all, like I said earlier, the frequency, the severity, the nature, the recency of the abuse. And then what we need to do is go against our social conditioning, which is, we're social beings, so we're very, very affected by the person in front of us. And so, we may gain very different impressions from the person in front of us about risk than the history says. Quite often I read a history of a case and I'm thinking, what monster could have done this? You know what I mean? I'm really shocked and upset by what I read sometimes in the case bundles that come into me. And then the guy walks in the room and it's like, is that him? Really? Is that him? And he seems so normal, And so we need to kind of consciously just kind of go against, actually both positive and over negative impressions, and weight our assessment most in what the person's done in the past. Going back to the question about what we mean when we say high risk, I think the key distinction that we need to think about is, are we saying high likelihood? It's really likely he's going to offend next week. Or are we saying high severity? If he offends, it's going to be really serious, And, I guess this is and ideally what we do is we combine the two and name the harms we're talking about when we're trying to talk about risk. So we believe it's highly likely that he'll continue to use violence such as slapping or pushing. We believe there's a moderate likelihood that he's, or we believe there's a low likelihood that Mr. Z will commit a serious offence again. So we're just trying to separate those two things out so we can talk clearly about risk. I've given you a list here. Antonio asked me to do an overview of ways of which people have assessed risk in the past, and there's a bunch of risk assessments out there, is all I can say about that. But they're different tools for different contexts. So this one, the DASH, people who work in the UK will be very, very familiar with this one, and it is it's relatively brief, at least in terms of its, there's 20, I think, should know this, I think there's 24 questions on it. And it can be done quite quickly, or it can form the basis for a very deep interview. And what's happened to it, I suppose, is it's become a kind of common language within risk forums in the UK. And it's in some ways, I think it's probably its most useful function. There's been some recent research to show that its predictive value isn't that great, actually, perhaps because when you get high risk rating, then the intervention goes in. I don't know, but anyway, I think its key function, and one of the key functions for risk assessment tools, is to provide a common language for different agencies different professions to talk about risk. And then I've listed some others. There's a movement to really just try to unpick and find out who are these guys who are posing the most frequent risk, who are disproportionately causing more harm, if you know what I mean. And so there's an initiatives to try and within any given area to target those guys, to really just kind of knock out the head of the problem as much as possible. Here's a couple of actuarial tools you can look at. And these two are structured professional judgment frameworks. This is the one that I'm kind of, personally, I think this is nice because it's brief. It doesn't take masses of training. It's relatively cheap to buy. And it really, it takes you through the structured professional judgment method as you consider it. It considers victim factors. And it also considers risk management and monitoring and case prioritization. So the structure of thinking, the framework for thinking is contained within it. And so that's the reason I like it. How are we doing? Okay. And so I guess risk assessment tools have great benefits, actually, but also some drawbacks, I think is maybe the word. So they definitely structure our inquiries into risk, as I was saying earlier. They can be a common language and helping agencies work together, therefore, to make coordinated responses, which is perhaps the most crucial when you move beyond assessment to risk management. It's this idea of agencies working together to cut down the perpetrator's options. But then also it can be very, very useful to go through these things with a survivor. And it can be quite revelatory, I think, sometimes, just to see that her guy is actually showing a lot of these factors that have been identified by professionals as risky, And it's useful to classify people, as we said earlier, too, if you're allocating resources. I think in terms of drawbacks, I think the most common thing practitioners say to me is, it's like, I've done the assessment. Now what? Do you know what I mean? It's like, you filled out the form and you've got it there, and there's the assessment, and you put it in the file, or you put it on your system, or whatever it may be. And there's a danger sometimes that it just sits there, and it's like, what next? And of course, the thing about that is these tools are only the start of the process of thinking about risk and how to manage it, And the truth is that whatever tool we're using, whatever framework you're using, the information we really need to manage risk is the detail that lies behind any given item. Is a high risk of emotional abuse, and so it's like, what does he call her? What's he doing? He's a high risk of violence. What particular kind of violence is he using? He's a high risk of control. Is he a jealous controller? Is he does a kind of an obsessive need for control in his head that forces him to control every aspect of the victim's life? Those are the kind of things we need, certainly within perpetrator programs, and also for profiling of the offender. These are the kind of informations that we need to know. So here's my question. I had to think. This is me thinking about it, right? I was thinking, well, certainly those who are causing severe harm do need increased monitoring from agencies that have got the power to impose behavioral restraint. When we're working in a perpetrator program, we're in this really, and victim support workers are very similar. You're working in this, a very powerless place, where you've got the person in front of you, you're worried that they're going to be posing risk, but the people who can do stuff are out there in the network, So high-risk perpetrators definitely need, the kinds of intervention that have been developed where there's a strong emphasis upon shutting down the perpetrator's options, disruption. So there's a kind of disruption and support methods that have been developed, that where you're providing intense support because these people are often very needy and have multiple needs, but then again, you're also trying to shut down their options through police action and probation action and children's services action, whatever it may be. And we also really need to understand whether there are other needs driving this behavior, such as mental health difficulties or substance misuse, which would make them, would that make them unsuitable for a DAP, a domestic abuse intervention program, perpetrator program? If they completely lack motivation, clearly they're not going to get on. There's no point in having them on if they've got, no motivation whatsoever and complete denial. And if we want to stop them, we may need to use intensive motivational work alongside disruption, as I was just saying. But I guess the question is, if those issues were in place and if motivation had been if the person had developed some motivation for change, would what we do when the person walks into the room be different with somebody who uses high severity violence as opposed to somebody who's used less severity violence? I think it's an interesting question. And I can't find much research on it interesting, so if people know about research on it, please let me know. The only thing I found was something from Zoe Hilton, the developer of the Odara, and her take really was that it just may need to be more individually tailored and more intense. So you basically a bigger dose, you know what I mean, in risk assessment terms and in treatment terms. But there are differences for us, for workers, big differences actually. That the level of burden that workers carry when doing the work, when there's a risk of very severe violence, changes. Because, and quite rightly, workers feel more anxiety, more professional vulnerability because of the fear that if you say the wrong thing, if you miss something, if you don't make the right contact with another professional or something like that, that the consequences could be very severe, And I think that is a real difference working with high severity perpetrators. And so I think what that certainly implies, whether or not the program content would be different, you'd be sending them to a different program. It certainly implies that when we are working with anybody, but working with high risk perpetrators, that there needs to be a really solid support structure in there in terms of protocols, procedures, where accountability is shared, there's good regular case management, and above all, high quality supervision from practitioners who've got more experience in the field of just carrying and thinking clearly about high risk cases. So in a program, we are a couple of minutes left. What are we doing? So somebody comes into the programs, we're identifying the risk that the perpetrator brings with them, both historical and how they present. We're identifying victim vulnerability factors, and via the support workers, we are hoping to reduce that vulnerability. And we're managing and communicating about risk within the agency and ideally also outside to the wider network. And we're working to provide a positive environment for change and doing all the stuff that perpetrator workers do in the room with the men, just all that stuff, all that stuff they do. In terms of what comes up often about in programs that I've kind of supervised or spoken with and so forth, is this one is such a common factor. That men get sent to these programs and you've got one index offence, brief description of it or something like that, or you've only got the perpetrator's count of event, or you've got somebody said there's a history of domestic violence in this family, and that kind of thing. And so you're left just not knowing what it is you're actually working with. And I think that's such an important factor for all of us, particularly those developing new programs. Sorry. The next one is about, again, lack of communication with the victim. Again, another core source of information, or difficulties in communication between the two sets of workers who are doing that. Again, because if you haven't got that, then you've got the perpetrator's account. And if you've only got the perpetrator's account, you actually bluntly know nothing about the risk this person poses. And I think relating to this one, particularly new programs, the perpetrator program is often like the new kid in town, if you know what I mean. So these kind of big agencies are sending referrals in, and it's very difficult to have the voice to set the conditions for referral, saying I have to have this information. This man seems risky to me, whereas it doesn't seem risky to the network. Things like that. So that's another common problem. So I'm going to wrap up there, I think, because this is effectively saying the same thing, and it'll be in your slides. It's just in a bit more detail. I guess it's a bit of a prescription for perpetrator programs around risk communication. And this is what I'm going to wrap up on, which is that part of risk assessment is taking notice of the impact of this work on ourselves. We've just been talking, haven't we, about what it's like to carry risk. And therefore, we all have a professional self that feels very competent and learns to cope with hearing about this stuff. But we also need to listen to our everyday self. It's less well defended, and it's affected by all this, whether we know it or not. And so it needs listening to, and let's look after ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris, for really getting us to critically think about risk assessments and even making some of the challenges of using risk assessments very real and relatable. We had quite a few questions coming in as you were talking, and we don't have that much time for questions. So let's see what we can do about it. We can stick around till about 32 past, I think, and have 5 minutes. I'm going to start off with a question from Marie. Marie is asking, does high risk actually need a different type of program? Does it not come down to behavior, regardless of being high, medium, low risk, as it is ultimately about behavioral change? What are the pros of having different programs for high risk?
Well, yes, that was my question. In a sense, I don't know. I actually don't know the answer to this. My feeling is that if other issues are out of the way, then it's likely to be the content of any given program, you know, in terms of the areas that you'd be focusing on, you know, emotional regulation, development of empathy, understanding of the drivers for the abuse, development of alternatives, group cohesion and atmosphere, creating an environment for change. I think those would be common, except in very specific cases. You know what I mean? There's one possibility, I think, where if the violence is evidently driven by very severe trauma in the person's past, maybe there needs to be something more focus on that and a different focus on that. But the other thing about that is, of course, who's going to do it? Because in truth, there isn't a well of other professionals out there thinking, oh, we'll take the really high risk guys. You know what I mean? It's us, you know, the us being perpetrator workers, you know, and also the timescale, you know, and you know, so I think one possible way of thinking about things like trauma is that, yes, that's work's needed, but also we need to do some, I guess, harm minimization work, which would probably look very similar to the content of many of the programs we use. But I'm absolutely willing to be driven by the research on this one. Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. We also had a question from Victoria. Victoria is from Russia, and she's saying that in Russia, the police only get involved when a murder happens. All appeals to her organization are strictly voluntary, and men at high risk still need to be motivated to apply. There's no court decision or referral to the program, and this is a big problem. It would be interesting for her to hear from you how you suggest motivating such men if this is not through a forced referral.
It's such a challenge when there isn't I mean, you know, we're talking about the UK. You know, in the last 25 years when I've been doing the work, there's been such a kind of flowering of multi-agency intervention. But when we started, it was kind of like that, actually. You know, basically, you know, police were saying it's just a domestic, you know, it was genuinely like that. You know what I mean? You know, it was, you know, and so a large part of the work we were doing back then was kind of, was political, really. You know what I mean? It was advocacy and kind of getting within organizations and saying you need to be looking at this and this kind of thing, you know. So and until there's that kind of network shutting down the options for the perpetrators, it's very, very difficult. But nevertheless, if you've got men walking through the door, then it's like, what's brought you through the door? You know, what for you are the costs of doing what you're doing? You know, I would really say, I guess, you know, what the condition that the programs I work with have, which is you can't come on the program unless you also give us your partner's details so we can hear something about her perspective, because otherwise you are working blind, you know, and he may well be using it. So in that case, you really need to be, how should we say, conscious of the potential risks of working with the perpetrator without contact with the victim, because he may well be just using his tendency to manipulate the victim. So yeah, something like that. But a big challenge and absolute go. Keep going, guys. Yeah.
Great. And I think this will be our last question. Unfortunately, this is from Sergio. How do you manage the balance between professional secrecy, therapeutic alliance, and obligation to report to police if a man confesses a violent behavior during a group or therapy session?
That's a really great question. I think you have to be upfront about your conditions of confidentiality, to say we will inform people if we think that you're posing a risk. You would say that we will contact your partner. We won't be telling her about every single thing you say in group, but we will be speaking and explaining the group to your partner. And around the therapeutic alliance, I think you just have to be straight. Do you know what I mean? It's like I'm not gonna spring any surprises on you. And as best as possible, you try to keep to that. Sometimes in extreme risk cases, you might have to spring a surprise, but just to be straight, so it's I guess the thing is that the therapeutic alliance is necessary. We have to get alongside the people we're working with in order to make this change. But in the end, that may have to be threatened or damaged if it makes the victim safer. You know what I mean? So the ultimate judgment is whether or not is that sometimes you may have to give up or put at risk the therapeutic alliance in order to make the victim safer. But it's one of those tensions that's just built into the work. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Chris, for such a rich presentation, for your answers to these questions. I'm sure you gave us all a lot of food for thought. We're going to move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Kieran McCartan. Kieran has quite the resume, so his intro might take a while, bear with me. Dr. Kieran McCartan is a professor of criminology at the University of the West of England in Bristol. He's an adjunct professor at the Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane and a visiting research fellow at the University of Huddersfield. He has a track record of public, academic, and professional engagement on criminological issues, including the origins and causes of sex offending and societal responses to sex offenders. He has developed a wide-ranging, multidisciplinary network around sex offender management and reintegration. He has conducted research for funders, including the UK Ministry of Justice and UK Economic and Social Research Council, the ESRC. He is the chair of the Sexual Offences Working Group of the Confederation of European Probation and has co-led a nationally based ESRC-funded knowledge exchange network on the limited disclosure of sex offender information in 2012. Among other roles, Professor McCartan is the international representative of the Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers Board, research chairs of Circles Europe, and has advised the Council of Europe and the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet in Australia. Kieran will be presenting on the topic of understanding the changing landscape of responding to and preventing sexual abuse in Europe. Kieran, the floor is yours. As for the previous speaker, I'll give you a heads up when you have 5 minutes left.
Thank you. Thank you for having me to join you this morning. And, just listening to the last presentation, I think there's going to be a lot of the things that I'm going to say that's going to resonate with this. And one of the most important things that we have to keep in mind when we're talking about sexual abuse and people who commit sexual offences is the lived reality of it. Well, so while we talk about risk, the reality is that the vast majority of people who commit sexual offences come from communities and come from society, and they're not necessarily others who are abnormal. They're just higher or lower risk in respect to their behaviours. So I'm going to take us on a bit of a whistle-stop trip through Europe and through what's happening at the minute. So we've got about 20 minutes, and for those of you who know me, I will struggle to keep to 20 minutes, but I will do my best. So, getting started. Okay. The landscape is changing around the way that we think about sexual abuse and the way that we think about offending behaviour. And a lot of this is rooted in ideas from criminal justice, but also in ideas from health. So we're now thinking more about harm reduction, and we're thinking more about prevention but as well as how we support people to reduce their capacity to reoffend. And, you know, going back to what was said in the previous presentation, we talk a lot about reducing reoffending, but often that means support for people who are at risk of offending. And that may sit uncomfortably sometimes, because we often know that victims and victim services and survivor services don't get the support or the cash that they need. And there's this difficult political balancing act in all of this. So we talk about desistance, which is how we work with people to reduce the harm that they cause. We take a very strengths-based approach in treatment and rehabilitation. So previously it had been deficits. It had been about how do we fill in these holes in your personality or your behavior. Now we look at things like, well, actually, what strengths do you have as an individual, and how can we use that to help us help you understand your behavior better? But it's also, like was previously indicated, about trauma and about the past journey that people have been through. And I think it's really important to recognize the research body of information out there, although it's mainly American at this point, with a little bit of Australian thrown into the mix, that actually we know that traumatized people traumatize other people. So understanding trauma and points to intervene earlier in people's lives is really important, but also taking a trauma-informed approach that reduces the impact of past trauma and allows us to think more clearly about how we might help and support people in the future is really, really important. But one of the other big conversations that we're having at the minute is about harm reduction. And harm reduction is really important because we can't change behaviors overnight. And some of us who have maybe tried to quit things or start things, or maybe if you've tried to quit smoking or you've tried to join the gym, very rarely do you do this overnight. It's in stages, and we have to recognize that managing people who are at risk of committing a sexual offense is as much about taking steps towards that. It's not going to be a cliff-face approach. And I think sometimes we think that if we put people in prison or put people on probation or put them in treatment, there's going to be an instant reward for this. And that's not often the case. There's a growing interrelationship, not only in thinking about sexual harm in the sexual harm field, but also thinking about crime and criminal justice and the interaction between health and well-being. There's this growing interrelationship between the two, with offending behavior being seen as a health and well-being outcome, but also health and well-being being an outcome of offending behavior. So we're moving towards this, what you can see on the left of your screen, the EPI-CRIM model, which is about bringing together biological, social, and psychological elements to help us think about it at each stage of society: the individual, the community, the societal, and how they come together. Now, in the UK, we do a lot of this, and what you'll see on the other side is what's called the biopsychosocial model, which underpins a lot of the work that is done in HMPPS and how these factors come together. But what I would just flag up from the model that you see in front of you, we do a lot of work around the individual. So we talk a lot about individual pathologies and individual risks and treatments and interventions for individuals, both in terms of perpetration and victimization. We have conversations at a societal level, but that can be quite challenging, which is part of the reason that movements like Me Too falter from time to time, because changing social norms is a big, complex endeavor and quite challenging. But I would say that we need to think a lot more about how we place this at a community level, and whether that's a community as in a village or a town, or a workplace community or a school community. People who commit sexual offences come from communities. They're known to people in communities, and communities have a role to hold them accountable for their behaviour, but also to support them in not offending. So recently, I say recently, it was before COVID, we started doing some work with the Council of Europe, who were interested in putting together a series of recommendations around sexual offending. And they sort of asked me and a colleague called Marianne Flugelstad from Denmark to come and present to them on the landscape across Europe. And the reality is the landscape across Europe is very inconsistent. And what you end up seeing is you've got highly developed, highly risk-centric actuarial countries like the UK and places like Latvia, but then you've got other countries that are more around structured professional judgment and have looser community management models like Italy, and then countries who are so diverse in their approach like France and Germany, where it's really a region by region and state by state approach to all of this. So there was vast differences in arrest and prosecution rates. Risk assessment was challenging to think about. Incarceration in prison varied from country to country with very little consistency around prison length and duration. Treatment moved from country to country, with some countries like the UK and Belgium and the Netherlands having very detailed treatment methodologies, which wasn't reflected in other countries. Community management was non-existent in certain countries. So if we think about Italy, for instance, Italy is at the starting point of a journey compared to other parts of the EU and Europe. Registration was and notification was very varied across the board, and actually how you share data. So we, after presenting this to them, they decided they wanted to develop some recommendations around this, but they didn't know what this would look like. And so in conversations, we decided that we would take a procedural approach from the moment someone enters the system and they move through the system. So what you can see on the screen here is a screenshot of the recommendations and a link to it. And I'm not going to go through them all because we don't have time, but it would really be useful, because these are just examples of good practice that are endorsed by the Council of Europe, to go and have a look at them and see what you think. What you can see on the other side is the core underpinning values. So the report was written with risk and risk management in mind, taking a person-centric approach, using an evidence base to what we want to find, and doing a multi-agency, multidisciplinary approach as well. One thing I just want to flag up that was quite interesting about this is the Council of Europe were very strong on restorative justice and wanted us to include in the victims and survivors section a call for the opportunity for restorative justice when and if it was possible and if it was feasible, and it should be victim-led. And I just want to flag up a project that's going on at the minute in Scotland with Thriving Survivors, where they're doing some really good work around restorative justice and victim-led concerns and victim-led capacity around it. This was followed by the Council of Europe did a piece of work where we reached, the Confederation of European Probation did a piece of work where we reached out to member states. So what you see on the screen in the coloured map is all the member states. The green coloured countries and regions completed the survey. The orange coloured ones did not complete the survey, but all the coloured ones are members of CEP. And in looking at this and talking about this, we found that they said that risk assessment was inconsistent across the countries. One of the big challenges that they had was countries having access to material in their mother tongue that was useful and consistent, with this idea that actually not everything should be presented in English, and reinforcing that a lot of the research and evidence is Anglophone in nature, which poses a challenge to some countries. Treatment of people convicted of a sexual offence happens across the board, but happens very differently. There are better and more consistent and evidence-based staff training. Staff training varied from a couple of weeks in one country to years in other countries, and that poses a real challenge around consistency. But one of the other big challenges was around cross-border communication and cross-country communication, and especially things like the role of the Schengen zone, where people can move freely from country to country without showing a passport. And what does that mean in terms of risk management? And what does that mean in terms of protecting the public as well? I just want to finish on a couple of pieces that are linked to the European Commission and European Union. So they've been doing some work on classification of child sexual abuse and exploitation programs. So the links to this are available. Really worth going and have a look. This is a really interesting and useful document that frames a lot of these programs within a public health modality and gets us to think about prevention and preventative working in a more strategic way. So what you can see here is that they've framed a lot of their work around the 4 stages of prevention. So the 4 stages of prevention are primary prevention, so big mass messaging, and community and social outreach. Secondary prevention, working with at-risk communities and groups to prevent sexual offending. Tertiary prevention, which we tend to think of as sex offender treatment programs, and the work of prison, probation, and therapy. And then quaternary prevention, so streamlining and harm reduction around this and what this looks like. So how do we integrate people back into the community, and how do we do this in a way that doesn't raise their risk levels? And that can be done through things like circles of support and accountability. So what we see here is they've broken down it in a public health frame, a criminal justice frame, and a sexual abuse frame as well. The other thing that's quite interesting in this is in thinking about these prevention programs at these 4 different levels, they've started to think about what does good look like, what does success look like, because one of the outcomes of this project that they're conducting at the minute is to have a map of prevention programs across Europe so you can see what's available in your country and what it looks like. And these are the criteria that have been developed around it. So you can see these include things like who's your target audience, what is the context, what is your method of delivery, how is it funded, what is the assessment, what prevention level is it at. So these criteria are what these programs will be measured against and reviewed in the context of. Following on from this, they produced another document which was a deep dive into some of this, and so they clarified their position around primary, secondary, and quaternary, and they linked it to socio-ecological levels, and they talked about target audiences and they give examples. And in these examples, they developed 4 case studies. So one was Circles Europe, another was Pedo Help. So they sort of took a deep dive into them and did a more intensive case study analysis around this. So it's really worth having a look at this document as well. And not only does this feed in to broad prevention and sexual abuse prevention, but I would argue reflects broader movements towards public health and criminal justice interactions more broadly. So the other side of this is there's a project that has just recently started within the last year or so called Prevent to Protect. What it's doing is it's doing the flip side of what the Council of Europe and the European Union are doing, which is developing resources for men at risk of committing child sexual abuse and men at risk of committing abuse. And it too is building a map, but it is more community focused. It is more pre-perpetration focused as well. And so please do go and have a look at the website, scan the QR code and have a look at what's going on there. We're going to be running a number of workshops over the next couple of years talking about this, talking about some of the challenges of secondary prevention and primary prevention, and thinking about what the landscape in Europe is and how we can reach out and engage and talk with at-risk populations in a safe, coherent way. And I just want to finish on one thing. And so this is a recent document that came out last week around registries. And this was led by EPAC International. And a lot of non-European countries, so a lot of East Asian and Southern Hemisphere countries have started to desire to have sex offender registries in their country. But the reality is it's not about registering their own people. The challenge for them is about information and data sharing about men who are coming to their countries from abroad to sexually abuse their citizens. So we put together a piece of a recommendation, a framework for good evidence-based policy and practice in the development of registries. And in that is the real question of, is a registry the best way of doing this? What are the challenges? What are the public attitudes towards it? And what are the impacts and the collateral consequences of it? And especially, you know, for victims, when we know that the vast majority of people who are sexually abused by someone that they know are related to. So, and that is my presentation. So I yield the floor back.
Thank you so much, Kieran. You were bang on time. As someone who works on sexual violence, I found that extremely interesting to listen to. I'm sure the participants share my sentiment. We gathered a couple of questions. So I'm going to kick off now. We have till around 11 o'clock. Then we're supposed to have a break, but we can probably take up a little bit of the break if there are any more questions cropping up. So the first question is from Dave. Dave is asking if you have any further thoughts on the significance of community for enhancing and supporting resistance.
Yeah, I think community is the missing link in all of this. And, you know, some of you might tell by my name or my accent, I come from Northern Ireland, and community is the root of problems and solutions where I come from. And I think that we really need to look at community building and peace building initiatives around this. So there's been some really interesting work done in the UK by the NSPCC in a project called Together for Childhood, where they're trying to build a community-based approach, a place-based approach to the prevention of sexual abuse, and especially child sexual abuse, in 4 cities across the UK, one of which is Plymouth. And so they're looking at how you upskill communities. So they had circles of support and accountability go in and train 100 random people from across the city on the realities of sexual abuse. They've worked with communities, not only about education, but about actually what do the police do? What does a court case look like? Actually, you know, what talking and thinking about employability, actually what the employers know about risk assessment and treatment, and actually how do we work with them around that? So I think community is essential in this. Communities have to own the problem. And I think sometimes we've done work at the individual level and the societal level, but actually a lot of these guys aren't pathological. And I say guys because this is who we're talking about. This is the main population. They haven't got severe mental illnesses. They're not pathological. And so this means that when we constantly look at them as individuals, we're missing the big picture. So the question has to be, how do we talk about pornography? How do we talk about misogyny? How do we talk about sexual harassment? And how does this feed into individual thoughts and feelings? So communities are essential. And you can change community values much easier than you can change social values. And so, yeah, I could talk forever about it, but I'm not going to.
Thanks, Kieran. We then have a question from Sandra. It's one of those $1 million questions. How successful are programs for sexual offenders, and what is considered a success?
Oh, wow. Okay, so if we're talking about prevention, that's a little bit cagey in the sense that a lot of prevention programs are small scale, early doors, usually run for 1 or 2 years, and then there's maybe not the funding there. They're not always evaluated with the same rigor that you might find, I don't know, treatment programs within the system. So, you know, or things like circles of support and accountability. So it's really challenging, and because prevention in criminal justice and sexual abuse is relatively early doors, we need to take a few chances, a few risks about this, but we also need to evaluate these rigorously. But the other problem is actually, how do you determine health and well-being outcomes from these? Because quite often we measure, does someone go to prison? Does someone reoffend? And reoffending is a really blunt tool about whether a behavior has changed or not. It's one aspect of that, but we don't really measure health and well-being outcomes and behavior change in the same way. So I think we need to have a very frank conversation about what our key performance indicators are. And like, we're not stupid. We know that it's easier to measure whether someone breaches, whether someone gets recalled, whether someone reoffends. But I'll give you an example from the UK briefly. Just before we changed all of our sex offender treatment programs a few years ago, a piece of research was carried out by Muse et al., which showed that 14% of people on treatment programs in HMPPS reoffended. Now, if you do a deep dive into that, only 7% of them reoffended at the same level of their index offence. The others reoffended at a lower level. Now, you could argue that that's a pathway to reoffending at their index offence level, or you could argue that's harm reduction. So that it's either or. But the challenge around that is they just scrapped a load of programs and went back and looked at what and changed what was being done, rather than saying, right, harm reduction is an important aspect of this. Most of these people don't stop offending straight away, but we talk about harm reduction in sexual violence and criminal justice differently than we do in the medical field, differently than we do in drug rehabilitation. And we've never really had that conversation. So if you have someone who gets into 14 fights a week and they end up getting into 6 fights a week, yes, they're still getting into fights and they're still causing trouble, but they're progressing in their harm reduction pathway. So when we think about KPIs and how we measure success in treatment and rehabilitation, I think we have to have the honest conversation about, is this just about red lines in the sand and saying, if you cross this, you've failed? Or do we need to start thinking actually about graduation and thinking about harm reduction? And I don't think we're there with that conversation yet. So it's difficult and there's no easy answers, but I think we really need to start changing our frame around some of this.
Okay. And a question from Anna. She's asking about the role of domestic abuse perpetrator programs in efforts to prevent reoffending of sexual abuse or sexual abuse.
So I think that they play a very key role in this, because, you know, a lot of abuse escalates, right? And abuse doesn't start from nowhere. You don't come in one day and do the worst thing you've ever done to somebody else. There is a graduation, a progression around this. And I think it's really important, if we can see warning signs, if we can see points of risk, that we're actually able to intervene and we're actually able to do some work around this. It may not work in every single case, but actually if you can divert people from committing abuse and entering the system, you should do that. But again, a lot of these are quite low level and there's not necessarily the evidence base around this. But I suppose my question would be, and you see it in the drugs field a lot, the best way to get on a methadone program or a drugs rehabilitation program is to be caught taking drugs, which is insane. So the logic is, if you transfer to domestic violence or sexual abuse, do you have to commit domestic violence to get support to stop you from committing domestic violence? We shouldn't have victims. It shouldn't happen. So if we can see points in the system where we can intervene, and we can intervene in a pro-social way, I think we should do that. But the evidence base on the success factors and the return factors isn't necessarily as well developed as we might like it to be.
Right. Thanks, Kieran. And if I may, I will ask a question too. I'm just wondering, from your perspective, how do you see us overcoming some of the discrepancies in risk assessment practices and sex offender treatment across Europe?
I think we need a common language around this. So when you go to certain countries, it's all about structured professional judgment. So like in conversations that we've had in Spain and conversations that we had a couple of years ago in Italy, it was all about structured professional judgment, which is fine. However, actually, where's the consistency in that? Whereas if you get 2 therapists doing a risk assessment, you're going to end up with the same thing. And as in many countries, we know the judiciary is not always a big fan of psychologists, because they think that we're a little bit wishy-washy, a little bit ethereal in what we say. And so when you have competing ideas coming from the same service or the same body of people, that sometimes spooks the judiciary, and they dismiss that. Now, like when you look at actuarial risk assessment tools, yes, you can be trained to use them, and yes, you can do them, and they give a degree of consistency around this, but we have to agree on a common framework or a common practice that we're saying, look, the reality is the best approach is a mixture of the two. It's bringing professional knowledge in and professional skills in, but also having a degree of consistency that is replicatable, and that means something when you take it to a judge, or you take it to a court, or you take it to a treatment provider, because risk assessment is the foundation of sentencing. It's also the foundation of treatment and rehabilitation. Like if you look in the UK, for instance, low-risk people don't get any treatment. So making that designation between low and medium risk is very important, and being very clear about it is very important, because that could result in whether or not someone gets treatment, either in prison or probation, linked to their offending behaviour. So I think we need to have very frank conversations and try to get to some shared understanding. And if you go back to the Council of Europe document, there is some language in that, there's some key considerations and key points in that, which are certainly worth thinking about.